By the third night of the White Horn blizzard, Red Wash Basin had vanished. Wind tore across the flats at more than 60 miles an hour. The cold had fallen to 29 below. Snow buried fence posts and erased the line between earth and sky until there was nothing left but white. A howling, endless white that swallowed everything it touched. At Cold Water Reach, one section of the willow windbreak snapped loose. Harlon Vexley tied a rope around his waist and placed the other end in Mara Bellweather's hands. She gripped it with both fists, planted her boots against the barn door frame, and watched him crawl into the storm. Inside the barn, 7-year-old Eli counted marker posts through the whiteout, the ones he could still see. 3. Maybe 4. The 5th had disappeared an hour ago. Behind the canvas curtain, 10-month-old Nell cried in the unfinished cradle. A milk cow named Maple strained in early labor, her breath coming in heavy clouds. Noah Pike, the ranch hand who had laughed at Harlan's willow wall just days before, lay exhausted beside the stove, his frostbitten cheeks wrapped in wool. The rope jerked once. Then nothing. 6 weeks earlier, this man had stumbled onto Cold Water Reach with a single plea: a little milk for his children. How did the survival of an entire ranch come to rest on his ability to keep standing? Late in September of 1887, Harlon Vexley reached Cold Water Reach with nothing but an old handcart and 2 children. He was only 39, but the trail had already aged him. His coat had been patched with 2 different kinds of cloth, one dark wool, one lighter canvas, the way a man patches things when he runs out of matching fabric and stops caring whether anyone notices. One hand pulled the cart, the other carried Nell against his shoulder, her small face pressed into the collar of his coat, her fingers curled around a button that had been hanging by a thread since Cheyenne. Eli walked beside the wheel. 7 years old. He didn't ask how much farther they had to go. He hadn't asked that question since the second ranch turned them away. Harlon had spent years repairing barns, freight wagons, hand pumps, and storage sheds along Union Pacific supply stations. He could fix a wagon tongue in a crosswind and rechink a log wall so tight the wind forgot it had ever been invited. But after Lydia died, childbed fever, 6 months ago, the kind of quick and cruel that doesn't give you time to say the things you mean, he could no longer travel with a repair crew while raising 2 children alone. 3 ranches had already turned him away. The first offered work but refused the children. The foreman said it plainly. Can't have kids underfoot in a working barn. Harlon picked up Nell and walked away without answering. The second gave them a bed for one night. A warm meal. A roof that didn't leak. In the morning, the rancher's wife pressed a sack of dried beef into his hands and said, "There's a family in Laramie who takes in children like yours." Harlon thanked her for the beef. He did not ask about the family in Laramie. The third was worse. The rancher looked at Nell, 10 months old, chewing the corner of her blanket because hunger had lasted longer than tears, and said, "She'd be better off with another family. You know that, don't you?" Harlon walked away. He walked for 2 miles before he trusted himself to set the cart down and hold his daughter against his chest where nobody could see his face. On their last day before reaching Cold Water Reach, Nell could only be calmed with thin grain porridge made from the last of their supplies. Eli sat beside the fire and quietly tucked half his cornbread deep inside his coat. Harlon saw it. He understood the truth. The boy no longer believed in tomorrow. Then Cold Water Reach appeared beyond a wind-scoured rise. The barn roof sagged along its eastern ridge. Its main doors faced the northwest wind, the worst possible direction for a Wyoming winter. An old willow row stood too close to the buildings and half dead, its branches brittle and gray. Smoke streamed sideways from the chimney, bent nearly flat by a wind that hadn't even started trying yet. But inside the corral, milk cows were still standing. Harlon stopped the cart. He looked at the barn, then at the house, then at the water trough where a thin sheet of early ice had formed along the edges, far too early in the season for water to freeze. A woman stood beside the trough, breaking the ice with the back of a hammer. Mara Bellweather. Her sleeves were rolled above her elbows. A feed ledger rested beneath her belt. One leather glove had been worn smooth by years of holding reins. Her hair was pulled back in a practical knot that didn't care about fashion. Nothing about her suggested someone waiting to be rescued. She watched the stranger and the 2 children approach. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She waited until the cart stopped and then asked a single question. "What kind of work do you know?" Harlon answered without offering his story. Stories were for people who had time. He had 2 children and a handcart that was losing a wheel. Barn frames. Hand pumps. Water troughs. Wagon wheels. Roofs. Doors. Hay storage. He paused. Looked past her toward the buildings. "And what do you need?" His eyes settled on Nell, who had stopped chewing her blanket and was now staring at the milk cows with the quiet, desperate focus of a child who knows what milk looks like but hasn't seen it in days. "Give my kids milk. Let us sleep somewhere out of the wind. I'll fix what winter is about to break." Mara glanced toward her barn. Her expression didn't change. "What makes you think anything is broken?" Harlon raised one hand toward the buildings beyond the fence. He pointed instead of waving, the way a man points when he's already sure of what he sees. "Your barn doors face the northwest wind. Every cold front this winter will walk straight through them. Your hay is stacked directly on the ground. It's pulling moisture from the soil and will spoil from the bottom up before the first hard freeze. That water line is buried too shallow. It'll freeze solid before the first real cold front. And those willow trees are planted too close to the buildings. Last winter, they caught the snow exactly where you needed an open path." Silence settled between them. Confidence was easy to find on the frontier. Proof was not. Mara looked at Eli. The boy stood beside the cart wheel, one hand resting on the axle, the other guarding the cornbread inside his coat. He didn't look at her. He looked at the ground the way children look when they've learned that eye contact invites questions they don't want to answer. Then she looked at Nell, still resting against Harlon's shoulder, still watching the milk cows. Mara stepped forward. She didn't answer his claims. She didn't challenge them. Instead, she reached out and gently lifted the little girl from his trembling arms. "The milk comes first," she said quietly. "Your claims can wait until morning." Mara led them into the kitchen without another question. The room was warm. Not hot, but the kind of warm that comes from a fire that's been tended all day by someone who knows what cold looks like when it arrives. A cast iron stove sat in the corner, its pipe running up through the ceiling. Dried herbs hung from a beam. A shelf of mason jars caught the last of the afternoon light. She warmed fresh cow's milk with a little water, tested it against the inside of her wrist, the way you test a baby's bottle the way Lydia used to, and then nodded toward Harlon. "Slowly," she said. "Her stomach has been empty too long." Harlon fed Nell with hands that shook from exhaustion. The milk disappeared fast. Too fast. The way water disappears into cracked earth. A bowl of beef stew appeared in front of Eli. Cornbread on the side. Dried apples in a small dish. The boy stared at it for a moment the way you stare at something you've stopped believing in. Then he ate. Without speaking. Without looking up. Before finishing, he secretly pocketed his leftover bread. Mara noticed. She said nothing. Instead, she laid another piece beside his bowl as though it had always belonged there. No announcement. No kindness performed for an audience. Just bread, placed where a boy could find it without having to ask. Harlon tried to feed Nell the last of the milk, but his hands were trembling so badly the cup tilted too far. Mara reached across the table and steadied the bottom of the cup. She didn't take the baby from his arms. She didn't offer to feed Nell herself. She just held the cup steady so a father could do what fathers do. Between quiet bites, they exchanged only the facts that mattered. Lydia had died 6 months earlier from childbed fever. Quick. Mean. The kind that doesn't wait for you to say goodbye. Mara's late husband, Calder Bellweather, the ranch's former builder, had been killed 3 winters earlier when a logging wagon slid from an icy mountain road. They'd been married 4 years. She'd never had children. The cradle in the loft had been Calder's project, started the winter before he died. One rail still rough, never sanded smooth. Cold water reach was carrying debt. 9 head of cattle lost the previous winter. The bank in Rollins had sent 2 letters. Mara had answered neither. That evening Mara opened the old foreman's room. She carried down the cradle from the storage loft, Calder's unfinished work. Harlon noticed she had kept it all this time instead of burning it for firewood. In a winter as hard as the last one, that was a choice. Firewood was survival. Keeping a cradle was something else entirely. That night, Nell slept peacefully in the unfinished cradle. Her small hand rested on the rough rail that Calder had never sanded smooth. Eli fell asleep with his hand still tightly guarding the hoarded bread in his pocket. Psychologists call it learned helplessness. When a child repeatedly experiences situations they can't control, they stop trying to change anything, even when they can. Eli hoarding bread wasn't greed. It wasn't misbehavior. It was survival logic. If tomorrow isn't guaranteed, today's food must be protected. Research from the University of Minnesota shows that food insecurity in children creates behavioral patterns that persist for years, even after the hunger is gone. The bread in Eli's pocket wasn't about hunger anymore. It was about control in a world that had taken everything else from him. He'd watched his mother die. He'd watched 3 ranches close their doors. He'd watched his father, the strongest person he'd ever known, stand beside a handcart with tears on his face and nowhere to go. The bread was the only thing in his life that he could keep. And Mara Bellweather, a woman who had never had children, who had kept an unfinished cradle in a storage loft for 3 years, understood this without being told. She didn't take the bread from his pocket. She didn't tell him he didn't need to hide food here. She didn't explain that things were different now. She just placed another piece beside his bowl. And she would keep doing it. Every meal. Every day. Until the boy believed it would be there tomorrow. If you've ever been the person who showed up for someone when nobody else would, type, "I know this feeling" in the comments. Because that's exactly what Mara did that night. She didn't rescue anyone. She just warmed some milk, placed some bread on a table, and carried down a cradle that wasn't hers to give. But before the sun rises on this ranch, Harlon Vexley is going to walk every inch of cold water reach and see things that Mara has been living with for years without knowing they were broken. And what he does next will determine whether this ranch survives the winter, or whether the white-horn blizzard buries them all. That's coming. But first, Harlon needs to prove that he sees problems instead of inventing them. And Mara Bellweather doesn't give trust easily. She gives it 1 week at a time. Before sunrise, Harlon was already walking the ranch. He didn't pick up a hammer. He didn't move a single board. He watched first, the way a doctor watches a patient breathe before reaching for the stethoscope. A short strip of wool hung beside the barn door, fluttering in the early wind. He studied how the air curled through the gap between the door and the frame. Not blocked, not slowed, just invited straight in like it owned the place. He knelt beside the haystack and dug his fingers into the bottom layer. Warm. Damp. A sour smell rising from beneath, the kind that tells you the hay is cooking itself from the inside out. He pulled his hand back and wiped it on his coat. He poured water into one section of the trough and watched how slowly it drained. Too slow. The pipe underneath was buried at the wrong angle, holding water instead of releasing it. In a freeze, that trapped water would expand and split the pipe like a green stick. Inside the house, a thin line of frost clung to the chinking between the logs. He ran his finger along it and felt the draft, cold air pushing through gaps where the mortar had pulled away from the wood. The house was breathing heat out and pulling cold in, every hour of every day. Outside, old ridges of hardened snow still rested against the fence where the previous winter had piled them. The willow trees had caught the snow exactly where the ranch needed clear passage. Calder had planted them for spring winds. But winter storms came from a different direction. The trees stayed the same. The weather didn't. Mara followed without announcing herself. She kept her distance, 10 paces back, arms folded, watching him the way a rancher watches a new horse. Not judging yet. Just measuring. When Harlon finally spoke, he pointed instead of waving his hands. The barn isn't losing heat because it needs thicker walls. It's losing heat because the wind walks straight through the doors. We need an offset entrance. A turn that breaks the wind's momentum before it reaches the cattle. He knelt beside the hay. This stack is spoiling from the bottom up. We need a raised crib. 8 inches minimum, with air channels between sections so the moisture has somewhere to go. He pointed toward the pump. The water line is too shallow. It needs to be 4 feet 8 inches at this elevation. with enough fall to empty itself after every use. Otherwise, it'll freeze solid before the first real cold front. His hand rested against the wall of the house. The chinking has pulled away from the logs. We need to reseal with less clay and more fiber, animal hair, rice straw, whatever we have. And we need to scratch the first layer before applying the second, or it'll shrink away again. Finally, he looked toward the dying row of willows. Those trees are too close. Last winter, the snow drifted exactly where you needed an open doorway. We need a windbreak set farther out, 34 feet from the barn at minimum. That slows the wind instead of stopping it. Mara folded her arms. Calder planted those willows. Harlon shook his head. He wasn't wrong. They work against spring winds. Winter storms come from a different direction. The trees stayed the same. The weather didn't. Some of the tension left her face. Not all of it, but enough. Harlon looked across the ranch one more time. 6 weeks, he said. Water first. Hay second. Then the windbreak, the offset entrance, fresh chinking, marker posts before the first storm. Mara studied him for a long moment. Then she pointed toward the tool shed. You get 1 week, she said. Then I'll decide whether you see problems or invent them. Harlon began with the jobs least likely to start an argument. The hay came first. Together he, Mara, and Eli lifted away the bottom layers of the stack. The sour smell rose stronger now, warm and damp, like bread left too long in a closed room. Several patches felt hot to the touch, where moisture had been trapped against the ground for months, cooking the hay from the inside. Harlon built a raised crib 8 inches high from old pine rails already lying behind the shed. Instead of stacking the hay into one large mound again, he divided it into smaller sections and left narrow air channels between them. Eli's job was simple. 8 inches, Harlon said, handing the boy a short piece of wood cut to the exact measurement. Measure each gap. Count every space out loud. Eli took the wood. He knelt beside the crib. He measured the first gap. 8 inches. He moved to the next. 8 inches. It was the most words the boy had spoken since arriving at the ranch. Mara watched from the doorway of the barn. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The boy was counting. He was useful. He was part of something that had a shape and a purpose. For a child who had spent 6 months watching his world fall apart, counting 8-inch gaps was the first thing that had made sense in a long time. Next came the water line. Harlon opened a test trench and found the pipe buried only a little deeper than 2 feet. In Wyoming, that was a death sentence for a water system. The frost line sat at 4 feet in a normal winter. In a bad one, it went deeper. It should be 4 feet 8 inches here, he said. And it needs enough fall to empty itself after every use. Standing water freezes. Moving water doesn't. Mara studied the trench. We don't have time to dig the whole line. Then we don't, Harlon answered. We protect the stretch between the well and the milk cows first. That's the line that matters. The rest can wait until spring. There was no argument. Only a shorter plan. The kind that works. By the 3rd day, stakes marked the outline of Harlon's new windbreak across the open ground northwest of the barn. It would stand 34 feet from the barn wall. Not in front of it. Not against it. Far enough to weaken the wind before it reached the buildings, close enough to matter. The frame would form an L shape. At its tallest point, it would rise 7 feet 4 inches. Lodgepole pine would carry the weight. Willow branches would be woven between the posts, but never tightly enough to stop every gust. Sod and brush would anchor the base. The shorter arm would shield the path between the house and the barn. Harlon and Eli were driving another post when a horse stopped beside the fence. Silas Gley, the largest ranch owner in Red Wash Basin, a man whose property stretched from the foothills to the river, and who had never met a fence he didn't want on his side of it. Years earlier, after Calder Bellweather died, Silas had offered to buy Cold Water Reach for a price that was generous on paper and insulting in practice. Mara had refused. Ever since then, Silas had spoken about the ranch the way men speak about things they believe are already theirs, as though its failure were only a matter of time. He climbed down from his horse without greeting anyone. He looked over the growing frame, the posts, the stakes, the pile of willow branches waiting to be woven, and smiled the way a man smiles when he's already decided what he thinks. So this is Vexley's willow wall. His boot nudged one of the posts. All it'll do is catch snow and bury your barn. Harlon rested both hands on the post driver. He didn't look at Silas. He looked at the post. If I build it too close, you're right. The distance matters more than the wall. Silas frowned. He'd expected defensiveness. Arguments. The kind of pushback that lets a man feel superior by comparison. Instead, he got agreement, partial, precise, and completely unbothered. Silas turned toward Mara. Since when did a drifter become your engineer? Mara never looked away from the survey stakes. She was adjusting the line of the shorter arm, making sure it would shield the path between the house and the barn without blocking the wagon access. He is not a drifter, she said calmly. He is my foreman, until the work proves otherwise. The words surprised everyone, even Harlon. Silas let out a quiet laugh. You'll still need my freight road once winter closes in. If you have business to discuss, Mara replied, put it in writing. Silas climbed back into the saddle. As he gathered the reins, he looked once more at the unfinished wall. Winter will decide which one of us is wasting time. He rode away without another word. Eli watched until the horse disappeared over the rise. Then he looked up at his father. What if he's right? Harlon picked up the next willow pole. Then we'll change it before the snow does. The first hard squall arrived sooner than anyone expected. Harlon had tied narrow strips of cloth to the willow posts before the wind reached the ranch. He wanted to see how the air actually moved instead of guessing. Engineers call it flow visualization. Harlon called it watching what the wind does when it thinks nobody's looking. The answer came within minutes. The center of the windbreak was too tight. The willow branches had been woven so closely together that the wind couldn't pass through. Instead of slowing down, it climbed over the wall, rolled downward on the other side, and slammed into the ground behind the barrier with twice the force it had arrived with. Thin snow and dry grass began drifting toward the barn entrance, the exact opposite of what the wall was built to prevent. One woven willow panel snapped loose under the pressure and slammed against the frame. An old milk cow balked at the temporary passage and nearly tore a hinge from the gate. Far across the basin, two of Silas Gley's hands stopped their wagon long enough to watch. Harlon could see them silhouetted against the gray sky. He could almost hear the story they'd tell at supper. He never defended the mistake. He walked to the center of the windbreak, pulled his knife, and cut away nearly a fifth of the willow from the middle section. The branches fell to the ground in a tangle of brown and green. Mara studied the moving cloth strips for a moment. Try weaving the next pieces on a diagonal, she said. Let the wind spread instead of fighting one flat wall. Harlon looked at her. Then he looked at the cloth strips, fluttering now but differently. The air was finding paths through the gaps he just opened, splitting and rejoining on the other side like a stream around stones. Diagonal, he repeated. They worked until sunset. Mara wove. Harlon cut and tied. Eli handed them willow branches from the pile, sorting them by thickness the way he'd been shown. Thick ones for the frame, thin ones for the weave. When the next gust came, it passed through the willow lattice, slowed, spread out, and lost its force before reaching the barn. The cloth strips danced gently instead of snapping. The snow stayed where it was supposed to, well away from the barn doors. Engineers call it the 40% rule. Research from the USDA Wind Erosion Laboratory proved that the most effective windbreaks allow roughly 40% of wind to pass through. A wall that blocks everything creates destructive turbulence on the other side. Vortices that accelerate wind speed and pile snow in exactly the wrong places. The best windbreak doesn't stop the wind, tires it out. Harlon had learned this the hard way. But what was remarkable was that Mara, without any engineering training, without ever reading a USDA report, had understood the principle intuitively. She'd spent years watching wind move across open land. She'd seen how it curled around rock formations, how it spread through gaps in sagebrush, how it lost its anger when it had room to breathe. Sometimes the best engineer is the person who's been paying attention the longest. The offset entrance revealed another flaw. The turn was too sharp, and the old cow refused the dark corner. She'd stand at the entrance, plant her feet, and stare into the shadow the way cattle stare at things they've decided not to trust. Mara measured the passage with her eyes. We widen it. They moved the gate, opened the angle, hung a lantern where the shadows had frightened the cattle. By the next morning, the old cow walked through without hesitating. As darkness settled over Cold Water Reach, Mara handed Harlon the willow cutters. Your wall, she said. She looked at the cloth strip still dancing in the evening wind. My wind. Then she smiled. Just enough to be noticed. We fixed both. If you've ever had someone believe in you after you messed up, hit that like button. Because Harlon built a wall that didn't work. And Mara didn't say, I told you so. She said, try weaving on a diagonal. That's the kind of partnership that survives winters. And the kind that builds something neither person could have built alone. But the wall was just the beginning. Because inside that house, behind a canvas curtain Lydia sewed, a 7-year-old boy is about to stop hoarding bread. And the reason why will have nothing to do with walls or wind or water lines. It'll have everything to do with a woman who placed an extra piece of cornbread beside his bowl, and never said a word about it. Edwin March rode into Cold Water Reach on a gray Thursday morning. He was the county livestock inspector, a man who had spent 23 years walking through other people's barns and finding the things they'd rather he didn't see. He never laughed at jokes. He never accepted coffee on a first visit. He asked difficult questions in a flat voice that made experienced ranchers shift their weight and look at the floor. He'd heard that Mara Bellweather was rebuilding her barn before winter. He'd also heard that she'd hired a drifter to do it. Neither piece of information made him curious. Curiosity was for men who had time. Edwin March had checklists. He walked the property without greeting anyone first. He checked the ridge vent. He tested the bedding by hand, pressing his palm flat against the straw, feeling for warmth, for moisture, for the ammonia smell that builds when urine sits too long under animals' feet. He measured the temperature inside the haystack with a long-stem thermometer he carried in his saddlebag. He inspected the distance between the canvas curtain and the stovepipe. He examined the drain valve beneath the water line. Then he stood in the center of the barn and asked the questions nobody wanted to hear. A tighter barn can trap moisture if the ventilation isn't adjusted. Deep bedding can build ammonia if it's not turned regularly. A hay crib can heat from the inside if the air channels aren't wide enough. A homemade water line can pull dirt back into the trough if the drain valve doesn't seat properly. That canvas curtain is safe only if it stays clear of the stove. Harlon listened without interrupting. He didn't defend the work. He didn't explain the reasoning. He just listened. The way he'd listened to the wind through the willow lattice, the way he'd listened to the sour smell rising from beneath the hay. Together they checked everything. The ridge vent was clear. The bedding was dry. The haystack read cool on the thermometer. The canvas hung 14 inches from the stovepipe, 6 more than the minimum safe distance. The drain valve seated cleanly and held pressure. Before leaving, March made one request. Keep records for 3 weeks. Morning and evening temperatures inside the barn. Firewood used per day. Hay fed. Milk collected. Barn moisture. Every time you break ice on the trough. Mara hung a ledger beside the kitchen door. She placed a sharpened pencil in the leather loop she'd stitched into the binding. March pointed toward the pipe where it passed through the barn wall. That crossing is losing heat. The section where the pipe meets outside air could become a cold bridge. If the temperature drops fast enough, that's where your line will freeze first. I'll box it with dry wool and wood, Harlon replied. March nodded once. I don't believe your system will work. Harlon answered without offense. You should not. Not until it does. Mara handed a pencil to Eli. Write today's numbers, she said. The boy carefully marked the first line in the ledger. His handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of a child who had learned that small, precise things were the only things you could control. From that morning on, facts would speak before opinions ever could. But before the numbers could prove anything, the cold spoke first. The first batch of chinking failed. Harlon had mixed too much clay into the mortar. It was a mistake born from habit, the mix he'd used on freight stations and supply depots, where the walls were thicker and the winters were shorter. But Cold Water Reach sat at 6,000 feet in a basin that caught every cold front the Rocky Mountains decided to send east. The clay-heavy mortar couldn't handle the temperature swings. After 2 cold nights, the fresh seams shrank away from the logs. Fine cracks appeared along every joint. A strip of wool held against the wall still fluttered in the draft, the way it had before they'd started. 3 days of work. Gone. Harlon reached for his scraper without complaint. His face showed nothing. No frustration, no self-pity, no anger at the clay or the cold or the logs that wouldn't hold. Just the quiet, steady expression of a man who had rebuilt things before, and would rebuild them again. We start over. Mara stopped him. My father used to seal sheep sheds, she said. Her voice was matter-of-fact, the way you describe the weather or the price of feed. Calder learned from him. Less clay. More animal hair. More rice straw. Scratch the first layer before finishing the second. Give the new mix something to grip. Harlon looked at her. Not with surprise. With something closer to respect, the kind that comes from realizing you're not the only person on this ranch who knows things. They mixed another batch. Less clay. Horsehair from the barn floor. Rice straw from last year's feed supply. Mara showed him how to scratch the old mortar with a wire brush before applying the new layer. Deep grooves that gave the fresh mix teeth to hold on to. This time the chinking gripped the logs instead of pulling away. Later that afternoon, while searching the storage loft for extra horsehair, Harlon found an old canvas roll tucked behind a stack of wool blankets. The leather stitching along its edges was still intact. Tight. Even. The kind of stitching that comes from hands that know what they're doing and take their time doing it. Harlon unrolled it slowly. He ran his thumb along the seam. Lydia made this, he said quietly. We used it as a draft curtain in a freight camp outside North Platte. She sewed it in 2 nights by lantern light while I framed a storage shed. He started measuring where to cut it, the gap between the sleeping room and the main room, where cold air poured through every time the wind shifted. You don't have to, Mara said. She was standing in the doorway. Her arms were folded the way they always were when she was deciding something. Her expression was unreadable. Not cold, not warm, just careful. The way you look at something fragile that might break if you handle it wrong. Harlon looked at the canvas, then at the gap between the rooms, then at Mara. It's the right size, he said. Together, they hung the entire canvas between the sleeping room and the main room without removing a single stitch. As they worked, Harlon on a step stool driving nails into the header beam, Mara holding the bottom edge taut and marking the placement with a pencil, Harlon spoke of Lydia for the first time since arriving at the ranch. She never feared the cold, he said. His voice was low. Not sad exactly. More like a man reading a letter he's memorized. But she always checked a child's wrist before she checked the fire. She said the wrist tells you more than the thermometer. He drove another nail. She could sew a tighter leather seal than most men could build with wood. Mara held the canvas steady. She didn't look up. But her hands moved slower, the way hands move when they're listening harder than they appear to be. Calder always set 2 tin cups beside the stove every morning, she said. Even when it was just the 2 of us. Even when we weren't drinking coffee. He said a warm cup made the kitchen feel like it was working. Harlon stopped hammering. He looked at the 2 hooks beside the stove where the cups would hang. Neither of them said anything more. The next morning 2 tin cups stood beside the stove. Steam rising from both. Neither of them mentioned why. The rhythm of the ranch slowly settled into something steady. Something that didn't need to be discussed because it was already happening. While Harlon worked with both hands outdoors, driving posts, mixing, chinking, testing water lines, Mara cared for Nell without ceremony. She warmed milk on the stove. She changed blankets. She walked slow circles around the room when the little girl grew restless, the way you walk with a baby when the world outside is too big and the room is the only thing that makes sense. Before long, she could tell the difference between a cry for warmth and a cry for food. A cry for warmth came in short bursts, urgent, almost angry. A cry for food was longer, lower, the kind of sound that builds until it fills the room. At first, she held the baby too stiffly. Arms rigid. Shoulders tight. The way you hold something precious when you're afraid you might break it. Or worse, that it might decide it doesn't want to be held by you. Then something changed. It happened gradually, the way most important things do. Nell stopped crying when she heard Mara's boots crossing the floor. Not her voice. Not her face. Her boots. The specific, uneven rhythm of a woman who walked with a slight limp on her left side from a horse that had stepped on her foot 3 winters ago. Tiny fingers reached for the collar of Mara's coat. Not grabbing. Reaching. The way a plant reaches for light. More than once, Nell fell asleep on Mara's shoulder while Mara recorded hay and firewood in the ledger with a pencil still in her free hand. The baby's cheek pressed against the wool of Mara's shirt. Mara's pencil moving down the column of numbers. Neither of them in a hurry. One evening Harlon stepped inside from the cold and found them standing exactly that way. Nell asleep. Mara writing. The stove crackling. The canvas curtain hanging between the rooms where Lydia's stitches still held. He reached for Nell. Mara gave the smallest shake of her head. She just fell asleep. Harlon lowered his arms. He didn't argue. He didn't insist. He simply laid his dry gloves beside the stove where Mara could warm her hands later. Then he walked back outside to check the trough. On another afternoon, Eli helped shell dry beans into a wooden bowl. He sat at the kitchen table, his small hands working the pods open one at a time, dropping the beans into the bowl with the careful precision of someone who treats every task like it might be the last one they get to do. After a long silence, the kind of silence that only exists between two people who are comfortable enough not to fill it, he looked up. Why don't you have children? Mara didn't stop shelling beans. Her hands kept moving. But something in her face shifted. A door opening just wide enough to let light through. Some rooms are built and never filled, she said. Eli glanced toward the unfinished cradle where Nell slept, one hand resting on the rough rail that Calder had never sanded smooth. That one is filled now. Mara said nothing. She picked up another bean pod. She opened it. She dropped the beans into the bowl. But her hand lingered on the edge of the bowl for a moment longer than it needed to. The next morning Harlon noticed something he had been hoping to see for weeks. The usual leftover cornbread sat untouched on the table. Eli had finished his breakfast. He had wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He had pushed his chair back and walked to the door where his coat hung on the peg Mara had installed at his height. He had not pocketed a single piece. Harlon looked at the bread. Then at Eli. Then at the door where the boy was pulling on his boots, getting ready to go outside and measure 8-inch gaps and count air channels and be useful in the way that only a 7-year-old with a piece of cut wood can be useful. For the first time since Lydia died, Eli had gone to sleep believing it would still be there tomorrow. Not because anyone had told him to believe it. Not because anyone had made a speech about how things were different now, how there would always be food, how he didn't need to hide bread in his pocket anymore. But because a woman who had never had children had placed an extra piece of cornbread beside his bowl every day for 3 weeks. Without comment. Without ceremony. Without asking for anything in return. She had simply put it there. And she had kept putting it there. Until the bread stopped being bread and started being proof. Proof that tomorrow would come. Proof that the kitchen would be warm. Proof that someone in this world had decided, quietly and without needing credit, that a boy who had lost everything deserved to believe in something again. Psychologist John Bowlby spent his career studying something called attachment theory. The idea that a child's sense of safety in the world is built not by grand gestures, but by the consistent presence of at least one reliable adult. Bowlby found that children who lose a primary caregiver don't just grieve the person. They grieve the predictability, the routines, the 1,000 small moments of reliability that told them the world was a place where things happened in order and needs got met and tomorrow was worth believing in. Eli hoarding bread wasn't about food. It was about the terrifying absence of someone reliable. When Mara placed that extra piece of cornbread beside his bowl without making a scene, she wasn't feeding him. She was rebuilding his belief that the world could be trusted. Research shows that a single consistent, reliable adult can reverse years of attachment damage in a child. Not through grand gestures. Through cornbread. Through tin cups. Through gloves left beside a stove where someone else's hands might get cold. Mara Bellweather had never read John Bowlby. She'd never heard of attachment theory. She'd never sat in a lecture hall or read a research paper. She just knew what a boy needed. Because she'd spent 3 years keeping an unfinished cradle in a storage loft instead of burning it for firewood. She'd been waiting. She just hadn't known for what. If someone once made you believe in tomorrow again, Drop their name in the comments right now. The world should know who they are. Because that person didn't save you with a speech or a rescue or a grand gesture. They saved you the way Mara saved Eli. One piece of cornbread at a time. But the ranch isn't done being tested. Because the first real cold snap is about to arrive, 12 degrees above zero, and it's going to find a weakness that nobody saw coming. A weakness in the water line. A cold bridge that Edwin March warned them about. And when Harlon misses it, when the water freezes and the trough goes dry, Mara is going to say something that changes the way he sees himself. Not because she fixed his mistake, but because of how she measured him after he made it. The first real cold snap arrived before anyone expected it. By sunrise, the temperature had fallen to 12 degrees above zero. The kind of cold that doesn't announce itself. It just shows up in the dark and waits for you to discover what it's done. It was the first honest test of everything they had built. The old barn had once struggled to stay above 19 degrees on a morning like this. Cold drafts would cross the floor all day, finding every gap in the chinking, every crack around the doors, every space where the wind had learned to enter without knocking. Now, behind the willow windbreak and the offset entrance, the milk barn held between 30 and 33 degrees whenever the inner doors stayed closed. The house burned only 5 armloads of firewood instead of the usual 7. The bedding stayed dry. The hay beneath the raised crib smelled clean instead of sour. Eli wrote the numbers in the ledger with his small, precise handwriting. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just wrote them down the way he'd been taught, one number per line, one fact at a time. Then the water stopped. The buried line remained open. The pipe beneath the frost line was doing its job. But the metal coupling beside the trough, the section where the pipe crossed from the protected underground into the open air, had frozen solid. Edwin March had been right. The pipe where it crossed into the open had become a cold bridge, a point where heat escaped from the water inside and cold rushed in from the air outside, meeting somewhere in the middle and turning the water to ice. Harlon grabbed an axe and broke the ice away from the coupling. The metal underneath was white with frost. He ran his hand along it and felt the cold radiating outward like a warning. I missed it. There was no excuse in his voice. No explanation. No blame on the weather or the materials or the fact that he'd been working 18-hour days for 3 weeks straight. Just 3 words spoken the way a man speaks when he's learned that excuses don't thaw frozen pipes. Mara didn't say, I told you so. She didn't say March warned you. She didn't say anything that would have made the moment bigger than it needed to be. She picked up a shovel. Together, they lowered the drain valve and began to work. They built a small wooden box around the coupling, just large enough to hold insulation but small enough to fit between the trough and the barn wall. They packed it with dry wool waste from the shearing shed, stuffing it into every gap until the wool pressed tight against the metal on all sides. They wrapped the outside in tarred cloth to keep moisture from collecting inside the box. And they left enough airspace between the wool and the cloth to let any trapped humidity escape. They worked until nearly midnight. The wind had picked up. Not a storm, not yet, but the kind of wind that reminds you winter is practicing. It cut through their coats and found the gaps between collar and neck, between glove and sleeve, between the places where clothing ends and skin begins. Mara walked to the house and came back carrying 2 tin cups filled with hot chicory coffee. She handed one to Harlon without a word. He accepted it without lifting his eyes from the coupling. His hands were numb. The cup burned his fingers in the way that cold burned skin registers heat, not as warmth, but as a distant signal that something was still working. I said I'd fix this ranch, he said. Mara blew across the steam before taking a sip. You did. The water still froze. She looked at him over the rim of her cup. The moonlight caught the edge of her face, the sharp line of her jaw, the practical set of her mouth, the eyes that had spent 3 winters looking at a ranch that was slowly falling apart and refusing to admit she couldn't hold it together alone. You promised to fix it, she said quietly. You never promised to guess right the first time. The word stayed with him longer than the coffee. The next morning they filled the trough again. Harlon opened the drain valve. Mara turned the pump handle. Water rushed through the pipe, filled the trough to its line, and then, when the cattle finished drinking and the valve was opened, the line emptied itself exactly as planned. Every drop drained downhill, back toward the well, leaving nothing in the pipe to freeze. The coupling stayed warm inside its wool-packed box. The tarred cloth held. The cold bridge was gone. For the first time, Harlon understood something that had nothing to do with pipes or winter or the physics of heat transfer. Mara was not measuring him by whether he ever failed. She was measuring him by whether he stayed until the failure was gone. Every man she'd known before, every ranch hand, every hired foreman, every neighbor who'd offered help and then disappeared when the work got hard, had treated failure as a verdict. One mistake and they were done. One frozen pipe and they'd pack their tools and ride to the next ranch, where the problems were fresh and the failures hadn't been tallied yet. Harlon was different. Not because he never made mistakes, but because he treated every mistake the way he treated the chinking, something to be scraped off, remixed, and applied again with better ingredients. He didn't run from failure. He walked straight into it, figured out why it happened, and made sure it didn't happen the same way twice. That was the difference. And Mara had seen it before he'd even finished his first week. For 3 weeks, the ledger filled one careful line at a time. Every morning, Eli wrote down the temperature, inside the barn, outside the barn, and at the water coupling. Mara added the armloads of firewood, the hay fed to the cattle, the milk collected, the moisture inside the bedding, and every time the trough needed breaking. The numbers slowly formed their own argument. Nearly 2 fewer armloads of wood disappeared on cold days. That wasn't much on any single morning. But over 3 weeks it added up to a cord of firewood they hadn't needed to cut, split, or stack. A cord that would still be there when the real winter came. Hay use dropped almost 20%. The raised crib and air channels had stopped the spoilage. The cattle were eating clean hay instead of working through layers of sour, damp feed that their bodies couldn't use efficiently. Milk stayed steady since the water line had been repaired. Cows that drink regularly produce regularly. It wasn't complicated, but it mattered. The trough had not frozen once since the coupling was boxed and insulated. Edwin March returned and read every page before closing the ledger. He ran his finger down the columns. He compared the early numbers to the later ones. He checked Eli's handwriting against Mara's, looking for inconsistencies. He found none. "I wouldn't call it proven," he said, closing the book and setting it back on its hook beside the door. "But it's doing exactly what it should." Harlon nodded. He didn't need more than that. Doing what it should was the only standard that mattered. Everything else was opinion. Later that afternoon, Silas Gley rode in. He didn't come to the barn. He didn't come to the Windbreak. He came to the house, or more precisely to the front gate, where he stopped his horse and waited for Mara to come to him. The way a man waits when he believes his time is more valuable than yours. Mara walked out. Harlon stood behind her, close enough to hear but far enough to give her the space she deserved. "When the snow comes," Silas said, "my freight road closes unless you sign spring water rights over to my herd." It wasn't a negotiation. It was an ultimatum wrapped in the thin veneer of a business proposal. Mara didn't blink. "No." Silas shrugged. The gesture was practiced, the kind of shrug a man uses when he's already decided that your refusal doesn't matter, because he has other ways of getting what he wants. "A few cold nights aren't winter, Mara. The real test hasn't come yet. When it does and your hay runs thin, and your freight road is buried under 4 feet of snow, you'll remember this conversation." He gathered his reins. His horse shifted beneath him, breath steaming in the cold air. "I'll be in touch." He rode away without looking at Harlon. After Silas disappeared over the rise, Harlon asked only one question. How many days of hay if his road stays closed? Mara looked at the sky. It was turning gray in the way that skies turn gray when they're holding something they haven't decided to release yet. 19 days by the old numbers, she said. Longer if the ledger is right. Harlon studied the gray sky. He watched the way the clouds stretched across the basin in long flat bands. He noticed that the wind had died. Not shifted, not weakened, but died completely, the way wind dies before a major pressure change. "We prepare for 26. Mara looked at him. Not with doubt. Not with disagreement. With the expression of a woman who has spent 3 years running a ranch alone, and has learned that the people who survive winter are the ones who prepare for more than they think they'll need. She opened the ledger. She wrote 26 beneath the last entry. She drew a single line beneath it. Not a question mark, not an exclamation point, just a line. The kind of line that says, "This is the number." We don't argue with it. We prepare for it. From that moment forward, the ranch would prepare for the winter they hoped would never come. Behavioral economists call it the planning fallacy. Humans consistently underestimate how long tasks will take and how bad situations will get. Research from Oxford University found that large projects exceed their predicted timelines by an average of 62%. People plan for the most likely outcome and then act surprised when the least likely one shows up at their door. But Harlon and Mara did the opposite. Instead of preparing for the most likely winter, 19 days of hay, moderate cold, a freight road that might stay open, they prepared for the worst one. 26 days. Full isolation. No road. No help. No supply line. This is what psychologists call defensive pessimism. Not negativity, but a strategic overestimation of risk that actually leads to better outcomes. People who prepare for the worst don't attract the worst. They survive it. Writing 26 in that ledger wasn't fear. It wasn't doubt. It was the same instinct that had led Harlon to build a windbreak 34 feet from the barn instead of 20. The same instinct that had led Mara to keep an unfinished cradle in a storage loft for 3 years instead of burning it for firewood. They were people who prepared for things they hoped would never happen. And that preparation, that quiet, unglamorous, uncelebrated readiness, was about to be tested by a storm that would bury the entire basin and decide, once and for all, whether cold water reach would survive the winter, or whether the white horn blizzard would swallow it whole. If you believe in preparing for the worst while hoping for the best, share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Because Harlon and Mara didn't survive by being lucky. They survived by writing 26 in a ledger when 19 would have been enough. But the storm is coming. You can feel it in the way the wind just died. In the way the birds disappeared. In the way a mare named Juniper turned her back to the northwest and refused to graze. The white horn blizzard is 3 days away. And when it arrives, everything they've built, the windbreak, the offset entrance, the water line, the chinking, the canvas curtain, the marker posts, the guide rope will be tested at the same time. And a man named Noah Pike, who laughed at Harlon's willow wall, is going to find himself lost in a whiteout with a dead horse and frostbitten cheeks, crawling toward a strip of cloth fluttering on a marker post that Harlon drove into the ground 3 weeks ago. That's coming. But first the sky has to change. And when it does, there's no more preparing. There's only surviving. The sky began changing 3 days before the storm arrived. At noon, Juniper, the oldest mare on the ranch, a buckskin with 20 years of Wyoming winters in her bones, turned her back to the northwest wind and refused to graze. She stood with her head lowered, her ears pinned flat, her body angled the way horses angle when they know something is coming that they can't outrun. The air grew heavy. Not warm. Not cold. Just heavy, the kind of atmospheric pressure that presses against your chest and makes you breathe deeper without deciding to. Low clouds stretched across the basin in long gray bands, flat and featureless, like a ceiling being lowered 1 inch at a time. Just before sunset, the wind died. Not weakened. Not shifted. Died. Completely. The kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful, it feels like a held breath. The willow lattice on the windbreak stopped moving. The cloth strips on the marker posts hung straight down. The smoke from the chimney rose in a perfect column instead of bending sideways. The birds disappeared. Not gradually. All at once. One moment there were sparrows in the brush and magpies on the fence posts. The next, nothing. The basin was empty of everything that had wings. Harlon and Mara stopped talking about improvements. Now they prepared for survival. Marker posts went into the ground every 18 feet along the path between the house and the barn. Harlon drove them deep, 2 feet into the frozen earth, and tied narrow strips of bright cloth to the top of each one. In a whiteout, those strips would be the only thing visible, the only proof that the next step had a destination. The cistern was filled to the top. Every container that could hold water was filled and set inside the barn where it wouldn't freeze. Hay was moved closer to the barn while keeping the air channels open. A balance between accessibility and preservation that Harlon had been perfecting for weeks. Every rope on the willow windbreak was checked again. Harlon retied 3 lashings that had loosened in the squall. He added a fourth lashing to the section that had nearly failed during the first test, the center panel, where the wind liked to push hardest. The milk cows and young calves were moved into the protected section of the barn. Extra lanterns were hung inside the offset entrance. A guide rope was tied from the house to the barn, thick hemp, knotted every 3 feet for grip, stretched tight enough to hold a man's weight if he lost his footing. A repair bag waited beside the door. Inside, willow poles, leather straps, wire, a hammer, nails, a knife, and a roll of tarred cloth. Eli watched his father drive the last marker post into the frozen ground. "Why do we need both the rope and the posts?" Harlon tightened another knot. His fingers were numb, but the work was automatic, the kind of knot tying that lives in your hands after 40 years of using rope. "A rope keeps a man from drifting," he said. "Posts tell him whether he's still going somewhere." Eli thought about that. He looked at the line of posts stretching toward the barn, each one topped with a strip of bright cloth, each one 18 feet from the next. A path through nothing. A road made of wood and fabric in the belief that the next step would find solid ground. While searching the shed for extra wire, Mara found an old stake bearing Calder's hand-cut mark. A small CB carved into the wood with a pocket knife, the way he used to mark everything he built. She carried it to the first marker position, nearest the house, and set it in the ground beside Harlon's new post. Harlon noticed. He didn't say anything. He just reinforced the post with an extra wedge of earth and made sure Calder's stake stood straight. In the repair bag, tucked between the leather straps and the wire, Harlon placed a leather strip that Lydia had sewn years before. A narrow band of tooled leather, the edges finished with a saddle stitch she'd learned from a freight wagon driver in Cheyenne. It was strong enough to hold a tool roll together in a crosswind. Nothing useful was left behind. That evening, Ruth Fenley stopped on her way south to stay with relatives until the storm passed. She left fresh goat's milk on the kitchen table. Her eyes paused on the 2 tin cups beside the stove, one where Calder's used to sit, one where Harlon's had appeared, but she said nothing. Some things don't need commentary. They just need to be witnessed. Near dusk, a written warning arrived from Edwin March, delivered by a rider who didn't stay long enough to warm his hands. An Arctic front is pushing south from Canada. Winds could exceed 60 miles per hour. Temperature expected to drop below 30 below. Once the snow begins, no one should leave shelter. God help you all. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. Now the ranch would wait for the only judge that mattered. The White Horn blizzard arrived before dawn. The first blast came from the northwest, exactly as Harlon had predicted. The willow windbreak bent under the force but held. The lattice flexed, the posts groaned, the cloth strips snapped horizontal in the wind. But nothing broke. The wall did what it was built to do. It slowed the wind, spread it, tired it out before it reached the barn. Snow gathered where it was supposed to, well away from the barn doors, piled in a long drift along the outside of the windbreak where it couldn't do any harm. The offset entrance broke the direct force of the wind before it reached the cattle. The cows stood in the protected section, their breath rising in clouds, their bodies warm, their water flowing. The cistern stayed open beneath its cover. The trough filled, then drained itself before the pipe could freeze. The coupling held warm inside its wool-packed box. Behind Lydia's canvas curtain, the children's sleeping room held its warmth. Nell slept in the unfinished cradle. Eli lay in his bed with the blankets pulled to his chin, listening to the wind scream against the walls and knowing, for the first time in his life, that the walls would hold. Harlon and Mara crossed between the house and the barn one at a time, clipped to the guide rope with a leather loop around their waists. The wind hit them like a wall of ice. Visibility dropped to 10 feet, then 5, then 2. The cloth strips on the marker posts were the only things separating a safe crossing from a drift that could bury a person in minutes. By midday, one marker post disappeared beneath drifting snow. The next one still showed its fluttering strip of cloth. The ranch was holding. Every system was doing what it had been built to do. Then the pounding started. Late that afternoon, a dull rhythmic sound echoed from beyond the windbreak. Not the wind. Not an animal. Something deliberate. Something human. Harlon clipped himself to the guide rope and followed the line of marker posts into the white darkness. The wind tore at his coat. Snow drove into his face like needles. He could see the next post barely, its cloth strip snapping in the gale. He reached the fourth post and found Noah Pike. The ranch hand was half buried beside the marker, his body curled against the post like a man who has been walking for hours and has finally found something solid to lean against. His horse was gone, lost somewhere in the whiteout, either dead or long gone. His cheeks were white with frostbite. His lips were cracked and blue. His gloves were frozen to his hands. Harlon dropped to his knees beside him. Noah's eyes opened. Just barely. The kind of opening that takes everything a body has left. "I saw the cloth," Noah whispered. His voice was barely louder than the wind. "That's why I kept walking." Harlon didn't say a word. He pulled Noah to his feet, draped the man's arm over his shoulder, and half-carried, half-dragged him back along the guide rope to the barn. Inside, Noah collapsed beside the stove. Mara wrapped him in wool blankets. Eli warmed water on the stove and soaked a cloth for Noah's frostbitten face. When Noah finally woke, he spoke between slow, painful breaths. "Silas's north barn, winds blowing straight through it. No windbreak. No offset entrance. The cattle are packed into one corner, trying to get away from the draft. They're still trying to reach water. The trough's been frozen since yesterday." He looked up at the canvas hanging between the rooms, Lydia's canvas, with its perfect saddle stitching along the edges. Only days earlier, he had laughed at Vexley's willow wall, called it a waste of time, called Harlon a drifter playing engineer. Now that same system, the windbreak, the offset entrance, the guide rope, the marker post, the canvas curtain, had carried him home. Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to. The storm tightened its grip overnight. The temperature fell to 31 below zero before sunrise. The kind of cold that doesn't just freeze water. It freezes the air itself, turning every breath into a cloud of ice crystals that hang in front of your face like tiny ghosts. Inside the barn, Maple, the oldest milk cow, pregnant and overdue, went into labor weeks too early. Mara took one look and knew something was wrong. The calf was turned. Its position was wrong. Not head first, not feet first, but sideways, wedged in a way that meant it couldn't come out on its own. Dr. Amos Keene, the country veterinarian who served ranches across Redwash Basin, could not reach cold water reach. Snow had buried every road, every pass, every trail. There would be no help beyond the people already inside the barn. While Harlon checked the water line and the windbreak, Mara washed her hands with warm water. She tied Maple's tail aside with the clean rope. She found the calf's front legs, one at a time, working slowly, carefully, the way Amos had once shown her during a routine visit 2 years ago. She hadn't planned to remember. She just paid attention, the way she always did. Eli held the lantern. His hands shook. "Look at her eyes," Mara said softly. He obeyed. He looked into Maple's eyes, large, dark, frightened, and saw something that steadied him. Not calm, but trust. The cow was scared, but she trusted the hands that were helping her. And if she could trust, then maybe he could too. Harlon returned just as the final pull was needed. The calf slid onto the dry straw in a rush of fluid and heat. It was small. Too small. Its body was limp, its legs folded underneath it, its mouth closed. It did not breathe. Mara cleared its mouth with her fingers, pulling out the membrane that had sealed its airway. Harlon rubbed its ribs with clean straw, firm, rhythmic strokes that mimicked the pressure of a mother's tongue. Without being asked, Eli placed a dry towel into Mara's hand. For one long moment nothing happened. The barn was silent except for the wind outside and Maple's heavy breathing, and the creak of the rafters bending under the weight of snow on the roof. Then the calf drew its first breath. A small wet gasp. A shudder. A tiny leg kicking out against the straw. Everyone stopped moving. From the house, Nell began to cry. Still weak from the day before, Noah pulled the unfinished cradle closer to the stove and quietly warmed another bottle of milk. No one stood outside the work anymore. The third day brought the hardest wind. Just after noon, one of the lashings on the north section of the willow windbreak snapped. The sound carried through the storm like a gunshot. A sharp crack followed by the violent slapping of loose willow against the frame. The woven panel shook. If it failed, if the wind tore it free and opened a gap in the wall, the wind would pour straight through the offset passage. Snow would bury the barn entrance. Within hours, the cattle could be sealed inside with no way out and no way to reach the water trough. Harlon reached for the rope. Mara caught the other end without a word. She wrapped it around her forearm, braced her boots against the barn door frame and nodded. Outside, the storm erased everything beyond the next marker post. The world was white. Not the gentle white of a postcard winter. The violent, screaming white of a blizzard that had decided to take everything and leave nothing. Harlon crawled from stake to stake, his body low to the ground, his hands gripping the rope with gloves that were already frozen stiff. The wind pushed against him like a living thing. One post had already snapped. The loose willow lattice slammed into him, knocking him flat into the snow. His repair bag burst open. Tools scattered across the drift, the hammer, the wire, the nails disappearing into the white. Only Lydia's old leather strap, the one he'd placed in the bag that morning, kept the bag from blowing away entirely. It had wrapped around a willow pole during the fall and held fast, the saddle stitch doing what Lydia had always done, holding things together when everything else was coming apart. Inside the barn, Maple bellowed. Nell cried from the house. Mara gripped the rope with both hands. Then she felt 3 sharp tugs. Their signal. Give line. She fed more rope into the storm. Harlon reached the broken section and braced it with a spare willow pole, setting it across the frame diagonally instead of rebuilding the wall. It didn't need to look right. It didn't need to last forever. It just needed to hold until morning. The rope grew still. Mara pulled. A figure crawled out of the white darkness on one arm and one knee. Snow caked his face. His coat was torn at the shoulder. His left hand was bleeding where the willow had cut through his glove. Harlon pushed himself upright beside the barn door. It will hold until morning. Mara looked past him at the storm still raging across the basin. The sky was indistinguishable from the ground. The wind screamed. The snow drove sideways. The world had been reduced to a barn, a house, and the rope that connected them. Morning is enough, she said. If you have someone you trust that completely, someone who holds the other end of your rope when the storm hits, hit subscribe. Because this story is almost over, and the ending will make you believe that the quietest people carry the heaviest things. But the 4th morning is coming. And when the wind finally weakens, the counting begins. Not of what was lost, of what survived. And then Mara Bellweather is going to hand Harlon Vexley a piece of paper that will change everything. By the 4th morning, the wind had finally begun to weaken. No one celebrated. There was no cheering, no clapping, no relief that announced itself with noise. They simply started counting. Every Maine animal was still alive. The newborn calf carried only a small patch of frostbite on one ear. A cosmetic wound, nothing more. The bedding remained dry. Water still flowed through the trough. The hay crib showed no heat or spoilage. The barn doors opened without digging through snow. There was still firewood stacked beside the stove. Enough for another week, maybe more. Noah Pike stood on his own feet again. His frostbitten cheeks were wrapped in clean wool, and he moved slowly, but he moved. He fed the cattle without being asked. He checked the water line without being told. He did the work of a man who had been saved by the very things he'd mocked, and who understood, without anyone explaining it to him, that gratitude is best spoken through action. Harlon walked the ranch with a notebook instead of relief. One brace had been too light. The willow pole he'd used to patch the broken section would need replacing before the next storm. 2 marker posts needed to be set deeper. The frozen earth had pushed them up slightly during the blizzard. The outer cloth strips would need stronger stitching. The wooden cover over the water coupling needed a better roof to shed snow. Mara watched him writing. You've counted every weakness before you've counted what survived. Harlon closed the notebook. The living can wait an hour. He looked across the battered windbreak. The snapped post, the patched panel, the cloth strips hanging in tatters where the wind had torn them. A weakness should not be allowed to hide behind success. Mara studied him for a moment. Then she looked out at the ranch, the snow-covered basin, the bent willow wall, the barn with its offset entrance and its warm interior and its cattle that had survived a storm that was currently burying ranches across the territory. Later, the clouds opened just enough to reveal a strip of gray sky. Steam drifted from the cattle as they breathed into the cold air. The children have their milk, Mara said quietly. Harlon studied the broken section of the willow wall. The ranch still needs fixing. Neither of them spoke about spring. Neither of them spoke about leaving. That evening, Mara placed Harlon's dry gloves beside the 2 tin cups waiting near the stove. She set them there as naturally as though they had always belonged. As though the gloves had been sitting in that exact spot for years, waiting for hands that needed warming. Harlon noticed when he came inside. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. When the roads finally opened, people came to Cold Water Reach for answers instead of rumors. Edwin March arrived first. He inspected everything without hurry: barn temperature, bedding quality, water system, surviving cattle, remaining hay. He read every page of the ledger from the first 3 weeks before the storm to the last entry written during it. At last he closed the book. The barn stayed drier. The herd burned less feed than expected. Stable water made the difference. The windbreak stood where the snow wanted to settle, not where the doors needed to open. And every flaw you found early was corrected before the blizzard arrived. He looked at Harlon, then at Mara, then at the ledger in his hands. I'll be recommending this system to every ranch in the basin. Dr. Amos Keene followed. He examined the calf, now healthy, nursing, standing on wobbly legs, and the frostbitten ear that would heal with nothing more than time. He examined Noah's cheeks and pronounced them salvageable. He drank a cup of coffee and left without charging a fee. Then came neighboring ranchers, men and women who had spent 4 days digging cattle from snowdrifts, who had lost animals to the cold, who had watched their barns fail under the weight of a storm they hadn't prepared for. They walked the windbreak. They studied the offset entrance. They knelt beside the raised hay crib and felt the dry air moving through the channels. Noah spoke next. His voice was still rough from the cold but steady. I'd be dead if those marker posts hadn't been there. I saw the cloth. That's the only reason I kept walking. Silas Gley came last. His ranch had lost cattle. Part of his north barn roof had been torn away by the wind. His freight road had been buried for 4 days, and his herd had gone without water for 2 of them. He offered no apology. Silas Gley was not a man who apologized, but he was a man who learned, slowly, reluctantly, and only when the evidence left him no other choice. He looked toward the willow wall, battered, patched, still standing. How far did you set it from the barn? 34 feet through the middle, Harlon answered. Then we adjust it for the ground. And you never weave it tight enough to stop the wind completely. No. 40% through. The wind needs to pass through or it goes over the top and comes down harder on the other side. Silas nodded once. Show me. Harlon walked beside him across the snow without another word. He showed him the L shape, the diagonal weave, the offset entrance, the marker posts, the guide rope, the coupling box packed with wool. Silas watched. He asked questions. He measured distances with his eyes. When he was finished, he climbed back on his horse. He didn't thank Harlon. He didn't compliment the work. He just looked at the windbreak one more time and said, I'll need willow stakes by spring. Straight ones. If you have any to spare. Harlon nodded. I'll have them ready. Silas rode away. Beside the fence, a neat bundle of straight willow stakes was already waiting. Mara had cut them 2 days earlier. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone. A silent blessing from a woman who understood that pride is a heavy thing to carry. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let someone set it down without making them ask. After everyone had gone, Mara led Harlon into the ranch office. She placed a folded agreement on the desk. The paper was crisp. The handwriting was Mara's, practical, clean, no wasted words. It granted Harlon a share of the ranch's profits, authority over water systems, structural work, and winter preparation. A seat at every decision that affected the land, the cattle, or the buildings. One final line stood apart from the rest, written in slightly larger letters, as though the person who wrote it wanted to make sure it was never missed or misunderstood. Eli and Nell would always have a home at Cold Water Reach, regardless of what happened between the 2 adults. Harlon read it twice. He set the paper down. Why would you give me part of something that has always belonged to you? Mara met his eyes without hesitation. I'm not giving you what was mine. She gently turned the agreement toward him. I'm naming what you already carried. That evening, after the agreement had been signed, Harlon and Mara sat beside the stove while the ranch settled into its first quiet night since the blizzard. The fire burned low. The cattle were fed. The children were asleep, Nell in the unfinished cradle, Eli in his bed with the blankets pulled to his chin and his hands open at his sides. No bread in his pockets. No cornbread hoarded for a tomorrow he wasn't sure would come. Tomorrow would come. It had been coming every day for weeks now, and the boy had finally learned to trust it. Neither Harlon nor Mara hurried to fill the silence. They sat in it the way you sit in a warm room after a long time in the cold, grateful, unhurried, aware of every small comfort. At last, Harlon looked into his cup. I came here asking for milk. I never meant to owe you a life. Mara rested both hands around her coffee. The tin cup was warm against her palms. The same cup that had sat beside the stove every morning for weeks. First one, then two that nobody ever explained. You don't owe me one, she said. But there is one here. If you mean to share it. Harlon smiled for the first time in months. Not a big smile. Not the kind that shows teeth. The kind that starts behind the eyes and works its way slowly to the corners of the mouth. The kind that says I didn't think I had this in me anymore, but it turns out I do. I'll stay until the snow is gone. Mara looked toward the window, where patches of ice still clung to the fence and the willow windbreak stood bent but unbroken against the dark. Stay until the grass comes back. He lifted his eyes. Longer than that. They didn't marry as soon as the roads reopened. The work still came first. In the following weeks, they focused on rebuilding the broken windbreak. Harlon replaced the snapped post. He rewove the damaged panels with fresh willow, weaving on the diagonal the way Mara had suggested on that first afternoon. He set the marker posts deeper. He added stronger stitching to the cloth strips. Under Harlon's guidance, neighboring ranches began adopting the cold water reach winter plan. Even Silas Gley, slowly, without admitting it out loud, began setting willow stakes 34 feet from his own barn walls. It wasn't until early May that Harlon and Mara held a quiet wedding, witnessed by Dr. Amos Keene and Inspector Edwin March. No music. No flowers. No guests beyond the two men who had watched the ranch survive the winter and understood, better than most, what the couple at the center of it had built together. The celebration lasted only long enough to sign the papers, because Maple was calving again, and the work didn't stop for weddings. Silas never attended, but the bundle of straight willow stakes beside the fence had been joined by a second bundle, smaller, wrapped in twine, with a note that read simply, "For the cradle." A few days later, Eli looked up from the ledger. "Do I have to call you something else now?" Mara smiled. "You never have to call me anything you don't truly mean." Eli nodded. Mara. For her that was enough. But weeks later, after tripping near the marker posts while helping his father set new stakes for the summer season, he blurted out, "Ma." He caught himself. Stopped. Looked at the ground the way you look at the ground when you've said something you didn't plan to say, and you're not sure if you're allowed to take it back. Mara rushed over. She brushed the dirt from his hands. She checked his elbows for scrapes. She straightened his collar. She pretended not to hear the word he almost finished. Spring slowly returned to Red Wash Basin. The snow melted into the creeks. The grass pushed green through the brown. The willow trees along the windbreak put out new leaves, bright and fragile, the kind of green that only exists in the first weeks after a long winter. Beside the barn post where Eli had just carved a new snow line, a mark to remember how deep the drifts had been, little Nell took careful, unsteady steps toward Mara. She was 11 months old now. Almost walking. Almost talking. Almost everything that a child becomes when she is held by someone who doesn't let go. "Ma." The tiny voice drifted across the yard. Clear. Certain. The kind of word that doesn't need to be taught, only earned. Mara didn't rush forward. She simply knelt, patiently waiting for the girl to finish the last few steps on her own. Nell reached her. Small hands found Mara's collar. The same collar they'd reached for months ago, when a baby who had lost her mother decided that this woman's heartbeat was the one she wanted to fall asleep to. Harlon watched from the porch. He traced his eyes over the repaired windbreak, the open barn doors, the grazing cattle, The marker posts standing in a line like sentries who had done their job and were now resting. It still needs fixing, he said. Mara stood up with Nell in her arms. She walked to the porch and handed him the second tin cup. That's a good thing. You said you'd stay as long as there was work. The winter of 1886 to 1887 was one of the most devastating in American frontier history. Known as the Great Die-Up, it killed an estimated 80 to 90% of cattle across the northern plains. Ranchers who had overgrazed, underprepared, and ignored the warning signs lost everything. Herds, land, livelihoods, sometimes their lives. Bodies were found in the spring. Buried in drifts they walked into thinking they could find their way back. But those who had built windbreaks, stored extra hay, and protected their water sources, the quiet, unglamorous work that nobody wrote songs about, survived. They were the ones who rebuilt, who restocked, who kept the territory alive when everything around them had died. The frontier didn't reward the loudest man in the room. It rewarded the one who fixed what was broken before the storm could find it. Cold Water Reach survived for the same reason. Not because winter showed mercy. Winter showed none. It survived because every weakness was fixed before the storm could exploit it. And because two broken people stopped mistaking loneliness for strength. Psychologists have a term for what Harlon and Mara built. They call it earned security. What happens when two people who have been hurt by loss choose to trust again? Not because the risk is gone, but because they've proven to each other, one repaired water line and one steady tin cup at a time, that they're the kind of people who stay. Research from the Gottman Institute shows that the strongest relationships aren't built on passion or compatibility. They're built on what researchers call turning toward, the small daily choice to respond to someone's need instead of turning away. Mara steadying the cup when Harlan's hands shook. Harlon leaving his gloves beside the stove where Mara's hands might get cold. Two tin cups appearing every morning without anyone mentioning why. An extra piece of cornbread placed beside a boy's bowl until he stopped believing he needed to hide it. A cradle kept in a storage loft for 3 years instead of burned for firewood. That's earned security. And it outlasts every winter. Who is the person in your life who didn't rescue you, but stayed until the failure was gone? Who steadied the cup when your hands were shaking? Who placed an extra piece of bread beside your bowl without making a scene? Drop their name in the comments. Tell me what they did. I read every single one. If this story made you think of someone, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who thinks they have to do everything alone. Someone who mistakes loneliness for strength. Someone who's been carrying a weight they were never meant to carry by themselves. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because the next Harlon is already out there, pulling a handcart through the cold, looking for someone who'll say the milk comes first. Plant your feet, steady the cup, and stay until the work is done.